When we think about what makes a country powerful, our minds usually go straight to the military, right? We're talking tanks, fighter jets, the whole nine yards. But what if that's only half the story? What if real, lasting success in world politics isn't just about being feared, but maybe, just maybe, it's also about being admired? Okay, let's get into it.
And this quote right here, from Fuad Ajami, it just nails a certain way of thinking about foreign policy. It's this idea that hard power is really all that matters. It's such a bold statement, basically saying that a country's popularity is fluff, a nice-to-have maybe, but not essential. The only thing that really counts is brute strength. But you gotta ask yourself, does that idea actually hold water in the real world? Is being disliked by other countries just about bruised egos? Or are there real, tangible costs? I mean, what is the actual price a country pays when it loses the world's goodwill? This isn't just some philosophical debate. It has serious consequences.
So let's break down what that actually looks like. When a nation's policies make it deeply unpopular, the fallout isn't just a few bad headlines. No, it hits you everywhere, from your national security all the way to your national budget. It turns out, being attractive on the world stage is an incredibly valuable strategic asset.
And this is where it gets really concrete. First off, you lose cooperation. Your allies get cagey about sharing critical intelligence you need to fight threats like terrorism. Second, in a lot of countries, being seen as pro-American can become a political kiss of death for their leaders, which forces them to pull away from you. Third, it hits you right in the wallet. When you decide to go it alone, well, you end up paying for it alone. And finally, and this one is terrifying, it actually empowers your enemies. Being unpopular becomes a fantastic recruiting poster for groups like Al-Qaeda.
And here's a perfect example of that economic burden in action. After the 2003 Iraq War, the lack of broad international legitimacy meant that when the bill for reconstruction came due, other countries just weren't willing to chip in with troops or money. It got so bad that one American administrator actually said, "I need the money so bad we have to move off our principled opposition to the international community being in charge." That's the real, direct, financial cost of burning through your goodwill.
Now, this loss of influence has led a lot of people, on both the left and the right, to start throwing around the term American empire. But is that really the right way to think about how global power works today? Does that label actually help us understand the situation, or does it just muddy the waters?
The thing is, when you actually compare the US today to old-school empires, the whole metaphor just kind of falls apart. Take the British Empire. They had direct, hands-on political control over their colonies. The US, on the other hand, couldn't even convince its own neighbors, Mexico and Chile, to back a key UN vote on Iraq. I mean, if you can't even get your allies to vote with you, you're not running an empire in any traditional sense. That level of control just isn't there.
So here's a much better way to think about it. Power in the 21st century is like a game of three-dimensional chess. On the top board, the military one, the US is totally dominant. It's unipolar. But on the middle board, the economic one, things are multipolar. The US has to negotiate with players like the EU, China, and Japan. And then on the bottom board, where you're dealing with transnational issues like terrorism or pandemics, power is just chaotic. It's all over the place. Calling that an empire isn't just an oversimplification. It actively encourages strategies that are destined to fail on this complex playing field.
So if the US isn't an empire, then what is it? Well, part of the answer is to look at these competing traditions that have been pulling the country in different directions for its entire history. You can almost think of them as America's 4 different foreign policy personalities.
And this table lays them out perfectly. You've got the business-minded Hamiltonians, the forceful Jacksonians, the lead-by-example Jeffersonians, and the world-changing Wilsonians. And the key thing to understand is that these 4 personalities are always in tension with each other, constantly pulling policy in different directions. This internal tug-of-war often leads to an inconsistent foreign policy, and that can really confuse allies and wear away the trust that soft power is built on.
Now, what's really fascinating is how these traditions can mix and match. The source material makes this incredible point that neoconservatives are basically right-wing Wilsonians. They've got that same Wilsonian ambition to transform the world and spread democracy, but they drop the part about working with international institutions to do it. And by choosing to act alone, they often end up undermining the very attraction and legitimacy, the soft power, that they need to actually achieve their goals.
Okay, so if relying only on hard power is costly and the empire label is totally misleading, then what's the answer? This brings us to a much more effective strategy, one that avoids getting trapped in a false choice and instead embraces a smarter, more balanced approach.
First, let's just get our terms straight. Hard power is the classic stuff. It's the power of the stick, using your military, and the power of the carrot, using economic payments or sanctions. It's all about forcing or bribing other countries to do what you want them to do.
Soft power, on the other hand, is a completely different ballgame. This is the ability to get the outcomes you want simply because others want the same things. It's not about coercion, it's about attraction and co-option. This power grows out of the appeal of your culture, your political values, and how legitimate your policies seem to the rest of the world. At the end of the day, seduction is almost always more effective than coercion.
And here is the big idea. The most successful foreign policy doesn't pick one over the other. It skillfully blends them together into what the source calls smart power. It's about having the strategic wisdom to know when to use military force, when to lean on diplomacy, and most importantly, how to make each one make the other stronger.
So how does a country actually do that? How do you get smart? Well, it's not just a change in attitude. It requires real, concrete changes in policy. It means you have to deliberately invest in the tools of attraction and influence, not just the tools of force. And the source gives us a pretty clear roadmap. First, invest more money in things like public diplomacy and cultural exchanges. Second, listen more. Communication has to be a two-way street, not just a slick marketing campaign. Third, be consistent. Hypocrisy is the absolute fastest way to kill soft power. And finally, work with your allies. Think about it. The Cold War wasn't won just by military might. It was won by combining that hard power with the soft power of democratic ideals that ultimately transformed the Soviet bloc from the inside out. That is smart power in action.
And wow, this chart really says it all, doesn't it? It shows the massive gap in investment. Back in 2002, the U.S. spent over 300 times more on its military than on all of its public diplomacy efforts combined. That's an incredible imbalance. It shows you just how much soft power has been treated as an afterthought instead of a core part of national strategy.
So in the end, it all comes back to this one central idea from Joseph Nye, the guy who came up with these terms. Success in today's world isn't about being the toughest kid on the playground. It's about being the smartest. It's about knowing how to skillfully blend the power to coerce with the power to attract to get what you want.
And that leaves us with one final thought. Centuries ago, Machiavelli famously advised that it's better for a leader to be feared than to be loved. But in our globalized, hyper-connected world, maybe the greatest power of all comes from being both respected and admired. The real question for any great power today isn't choosing between its sword and its ideals, but learning how to wield both of them effectively.
So when we talk about power, what usually comes to mind? Probably tanks, jets, economic sanctions, right? The heavy stuff. But there's another kind of power out there, this magnetic force that countries use to get what they want without firing a single shot. It's called soft power. The question is, how do you actually use something as seemingly vague as cultural attraction to achieve real-world goals? Well, let's break it down.
Weaponize attraction. I mean, it sounds like something straight out of a spy novel, doesn't it? But that is the billion-dollar question for governments all over the world. How do you transform something as unpredictable as your nation's cool factor into a concrete, reliable tool for foreign policy? How do you actually make it work for you?
Okay, to really get this, you've got to see the two sides of the coin. On one side, you've got hard power. That's the sledgehammer. It's military force, it's economic sanctions. It's all about command and control, and you tend to see the results pretty fast. But soft power, that's the long game. It's way more like planting a garden. You have to attract, you have to persuade, and the real impact, you might not see that for years or even decades.
So what are we really talking about here? The source material defines soft power as the ability to get what you want through attraction, not through force or payments. We're talking about things like your movies, the reputation of your universities, your music, the whole shebang. But here's the really tricky part. Governments don't directly control most of this stuff. It only works if the world wants to be attracted to what you're offering. You can't force it. This isn't just a simple on or off switch. Power really exists on a spectrum. Over on one end, you have the hard stuff. Outright coercion and payments, the classic sticks and carrots. But as you slide over to the other side, you get into the realm of soft power. And over here, it's all about setting the agenda and pure, simple attraction. It's the subtle art of making other people want what you want, which, in the long run, can be way more powerful.
So this idea of wielding influence, it isn't new.
Not by a long shot. In fact, countries have been trying to master this game for well over a century. So let's take a quick trip through the history of what we now call public diplomacy. It kind of started with a bit of national pride. Back in 1883, after a tough military loss, France created the Alliance Française to boost its global image through language and literature. But then the World Wars hit and things got a lot more serious. We saw the rise of full-on propaganda machines. Radio became a brand new battleground, with outfits like the BBC trying to shape global opinion. By the time the Cold War rolled around, this had become an all-out ideological war for hearts and minds, with official government agencies leading the charge. But even as this was all happening, a huge debate was raging behind the scenes. Do you go for the direct approach, the tough-minded propaganda with a very clear political message? Or do you play the long game, the tender-minded cultural diplomacy of art, books, and student exchanges, slowly building relationships over decades? This tension is right at the heart of how you wield soft power. And then, everything changed. The information revolution didn't just speed things up, it completely rewrote the rulebook on how influence works. All of a sudden, public opinion became a massive player on the world stage. With the spread of democracy, you couldn't just win over a king anymore. You had to win over an entire population. And then there's this thing called the paradox of plenty. We are literally drowning in information, which means the most valuable currency in the world isn't data anymore, it's attention. And that brings us to the absolute core of the matter. In today's information-drenched world, power isn't just about who has the biggest army or the biggest economy. It's about who tells the most compelling story. It has become a global battle of narratives, and the winner is the one whose story actually sticks. So in this crowded, noisy, chaotic world, what's the one thing a nation needs more than anything else to win that contest? It's simple: credibility. Trust is the new gold standard of power. If people don't believe you, your message is just noise, no matter how loud you shout it. And that currency, that credibility, can just vanish in a heartbeat. The source material points to a really stark example: the exaggerated claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Sure, it might have achieved a short-term political goal, but the long-term damage to American and British credibility was just immense. It's a painful lesson in how fragile this asset truly is. So, given this new, incredibly complex world of influence, how do you navigate it? How do you play the game today? Well, the source material gives us a playbook, a 3-part strategy for modern public diplomacy. The key is that you have to think on 3 different timelines all at the same time: the daily firefight, the year-long campaign, and the decades-long process of building relationships. Let's dive into each one. First up, the daily battle. This is all about the 24/7 news cycle. You're constantly out there explaining your policies, and maybe more importantly, you have a team that is ready to jump on misinformation and false narratives before they can go viral. Think of it as playing defense, protecting your story from one moment to the next. Next, you zoom out a bit. This is the medium-term strategy. This is like running a year-long political campaign, but for your entire country. You pick a few core messages, a few central themes, and you just hammer them home again and again through big events, speeches, and new initiatives. It's all about building your nation's brand on the world stage. And finally, we have the long game, building real, lasting relationships. This is the patient, sometimes decades-long work of connecting people through things like scholarship programs, cultural exchanges, and international conferences. These personal connections create this deep reservoir of goodwill and mutual understanding that can weather just about any political storm. But here's the golden rule, the one thing you absolutely cannot forget. This isn't just about marketing. If your actual policies are unpopular or seen as arrogant, no amount of slick advertising is going to save you. You can't sell a bad product, and you can't fake soft power. Your actions have to match your words. Period. And yet, when you follow the money, a very different story starts to emerge. Just take a look at this table from 2002. The U.S. spent over 300 times more on its military, on hard power, than on all of its public diplomacy combined. Now, the gap is smaller for places like France and the UK, but it's still huge. It's a crystal clear picture of what's been traditionally valued more: the power to command versus the power to attract. And that leaves us with one final, crucial question to chew on. In a world that's facing challenges that no one nation can solve alone, we're talking everything from terrorism to climate change to pandemics, what's the real cost of being feared but not followed? In the end, What good is all that power if, when you really need it, no one is willing to stand with you?